And on to item 17.01, Infrastructure Task Force Elementary School Recommendations. And I see you already coming, Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, on the way to the podium.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, Dr. Waltz. Our item before you this evening is a report from the Infrastructure Task Force, specifically dealing with elementary school recommendations. The school board created the Infrastructure Task Force on June 15th, 2016, which was intended to provide an assessment of the state of our school-based infrastructure and focusing primarily on the differences between our older and newer schools, and to provide a recommended list of improvements to bring our older schools up to par with newer facilities. Sounds kind of familiar. Mr. Don Richardson, our chairman of the Infrastructure Task Force, will be providing a presentation regarding the task force recommendations relative to elementary improvements. We've spent the past year working on the elementary side, and beginning at our last meeting this coming year, we are working on looking at a similar review and set of recommendations that will involve middle and high school programs. Mr. Richardson? And actually, if we have other members of the task force, if you'd like to come down front so that we can be recognized.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Okay. Let's see if I can make this work. Very good. Oh, good evening, Chairman Sawyers, members of the board, Dr. Waltz, and welcome, Ms. Arnold. I am Don Richardson, and I'm the chairman of the Infrastructure Task Force. We have spent a little over the past year talking about primarily the elementary schools. We made the decision early on that we would focus on the elementary schools first, and then the second year work on middle schools and high schools, mostly because there's a disparity between the programs and the infrastructure needs, and so it just made sense to divide it up that way. Let me get this right here. As Mr. Klein said, this was our mission. I won't repeat it. He basically went through all of this. But our focus, again, was the differences between the older and the newer schools. And we are looking primarily at recommendations that affect the CIP, not other sides of the budget. Quick review, the stellar talent that you all appointed to our committee. They've all been very active and very involved. There's been a lot of discussion and questions. It's been a good process. Again, very quickly, this was our deliverable. We are going to review existing schools against what our facility standard is. Where is each school different from what the current elementary school standard is? We did prioritize and evaluate all of the differences, and we came up with a matrix of what it would cost, both across the board for a particular kind of deficiency, say lack of an activity room, and vertically what it would cost to fix all the deficiencies at each particular school. This spreadsheet will be posted on the facility services part of the website, and I'm sure you have it in your materials also. This will give you a better feeling for the detail behind what we're talking about tonight. We talked quite a bit about the differences and how we would prioritize all this. We are in agreement that there's two things that are important. Mainly, we want to focus on things that will improve the instructional experience, but we also recognize that safety and security considerations are important, very important to parents, but they also do impact the effectiveness of instruction. We looked at quite a bit of data over the year, and we boiled it down. We are obviously not going to recommend that you do everything to fix everything that we found. There were a lot of topics that simply won't be able to be remediated right away. Among the challenges we faced is that there's many different elementary school prototypes, and trying to adopt a cookie-cutter approach to adding space would be difficult. Different sites have different challenges. Things that would work at one site might not work at another site, and it would be better to keep some flexibility in that regard. The other thing is that trying to do standalone projects is more expensive. You're better off trying to bundle these fixes with already planned renovations and additions as part of your CIP, because there's significant cost savings to doing that. It's also easier for staff to manage as part of an overall process. You're going to have to identify some additional funding in the CIP. Now, obviously the task force and many people would prefer to address all the identified needs all at once, but limiting you is that it's just too many projects for staff to manage effectively all at one time, and also likely among the contractor community there's not going to be enough capacity to do that. So the conclusion is that we should address all these changes over the course of the existing 10-year CIP. We believe we can identify some recommendations that can be added to the current CIP that, once completed, will allow all of the older schools to receive some help toward parity. Very briefly, I want to mention environmental issues. We did spend a fair amount of time talking about environmental issues. They're very important, not only to our members, but to a lot of people. The difficulty is that, number one, environmental issues are not really an older school versus a newer school issue. And the other issue is that they're not really dealt with as part of the CIP. When staff is made aware of issues, they move and they deal with them right away. There are a variety of environmental issues that are considered. Lead management, testing drinking water, paint and tile glazing, looking for asbestos that needs abatement, and other various environmental issues, as you can see. Staff has an ongoing mandate to deal with these as they happen, so while we did talk about it, it's really out of scope for what we're recommending. It is also important to recognize that not all environmental issues are something that the school division can handle on its own. We have to coordinate on a regular basis with other organizations and utilities, such as the County Service Authority, to ensure that the highest quality of service to the schools continues. And of course, that's very important that that relationship between our staff and other organizations continue going forward. Specific recommendations. There are three. We prioritized into several groups. And the first one was security and safety related improvements. Now the good news here is that the Safe Schools Advisory Council some time ago had identified physical improvements that needed to be made. Many of our schools have already received these improvements. Additionally, some of the schools are scheduled to get them in the existing CIP, and what we're recommending is that you assign some additional funds so that over the course of the current CIP, the remaining schools also get those improvements. This is a relatively small dollar amount total, so we're recommending that's one priority that you knock out right off the bat. We also suggest that you ask the Safe Schools Advisory Council to give you an update as to whether they've identified any additional physical infrastructure issues that need addressing, so that we can include that in the plan at a future date. The second and the more expensive piece of this is we decided that the most effective way to achieve better equity with the older schools is to provide them with additional instructional related spaces. So we're suggesting that many of the schools are in the CIP already to receive these kind of improvements, and all we're suggesting you do is that you accelerate the current CIP so that over the course of the current 10-year CIP, every one of the older schools gets some additional instructional space to balance things out a little bit. And I'll get to that, I'll get to the cost of that in a little bit. We're recommending that flexibility be kept to allow staff to tailor the needs at each site, because there are site limitations. Site-based programs also, there may be some preferences to do one thing or the other. One school might prefer to get an activity room, another school might prefer to get a story room, and so we're suggesting that you keep some flexibility where that's concerned. The third category was technology improvements, going along with the technology improvement plan you already have in place. And I have some good news for you there. By the end of FY18, the 10 gigabyte network bandwidth will be in place, what some of us would call a fat pipe. And then also by the end of FY22, the TIP indicates that there will be a wireless access point in every classroom. I think we're about halfway there now. Right now, a lot of the schools have only one access point for every 2 classrooms. But once you get there, you will have equity in terms of the overall infrastructure among all the schools. Beyond that, you really can't go because there's so many differences from each elementary school based on site-based preferences in terms of what kind of devices they put on their network and how they use them. It's very, very difficult to really address equity at that point. But we will at least give the baseline infrastructure some equity. It's already in the CIP for that time frame, so you don't need to identify any additional money to do that. And when we talk about the instructional space, I'll reiterate that we're recommending that you keep some flexibility. You might, for example, want to put in a STEM room or a STEAM room rather than a science lab. Again, it's going to depend on your program preferences. We're going to provide as documentation the cost matrix that we put together. It's going to be on the website under Facility Services. And as I said earlier, it addresses each individual school's costs based on what their deficiencies are, and then across the board what it would cost for each kind of deficiency division-wide. We also recognize there's some things we talked about that we have not been able to prioritize for you at this time. And just keep them in mind if you have the time and money to do it later. Some of these other things would be nice to tackle. Some of those things include additional ball fields, better parking lot lighting, dividable cafeterias, and security apartments. Again, these were things that we all felt were worth talking about, but they didn't rise to the level of what we would consider our highest priority recommendation to you. Now, the money. Again, when you're looking at these numbers, keep in mind this is current dollars, so as time goes forward, you'll have to adjust for inflation. Also keep in mind that for the first item, the security-related improvements, that's just for the schools that are not already in the CIP to get the security improvements. It's not all the schools. As you see, it's a relatively small number, all things considered. Now, when you talk about the next group, the next 4 bullets, this is what it would cost to remedy the deficiency if we gave every school lacking a science lab a science lab. Again, not including the ones that are already in the CIP to get a science lab, just the ones that are not in the CIP right now. Same thing for the activity rooms, the strings rooms, and the story rooms. It looks like a lot of money, but you're going to save a lot of money because this is the worst case scenario. This is if you did it as a standalone project, and you're not going to do it that way. You're going to do it as part of renovations and additions already planned, and when you bundle it all together, the contractor is more efficient and you save money. So this is, look on these as worst case numbers, and also look on these as numbers that are going to happen over a 10-year CIP. They're not happening all at once. We identified a couple of $1 million worth of parking on-site improvements that could be made. You might want to consider that. And as I said, in terms of the current CIP, you've already got everything scheduled for the technology improvements, so there's no additional money needed there. Just remember, again, that this is going to be adjusted for inflation as you go forward. Let's see. Just a reminder of what you already know. Our CIP operates on a 20 to 25-year renewal cycle. Schools that were built in the 90s are now being renovated. There are a lot of projects that have already been completed, so they don't show up here, such as air conditioning the schools and air conditioning the kitchens. Over the last 5 years, we've renovated 14 schools, and we currently have over $600 million planned for renovations, renewals, and repairs at all school levels, not just elementary, over the next 10-year CIP. Path forward, we are going to dive right back into it in January and start talking about the middle schools and the high schools. We recognize, as we heard tonight, that there's a lot of concern about the high schools and their facilities. It's going to be challenging because the programs and the way the schools operate, and indeed the facilities they have, are different from the elementary levels. And so it's going to be a different discussion for us, but hopefully we'll get there and come forward again next year with about this time with some recommendations for what you could do with the CIP to bring some of those older high schools forward toward equity as people are asking. We will come back to you, I imagine, next June with an interim report, let you know how we're doing, just like we did this June with the elementary schools, and then finish up this process in time for next year's CIP. And that's all I have, so if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you.
Thank you very much. Questions, Mr. Trenum?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Richardson. It's good to see you back before the school board. First off, I want to thank all the task force members for being a participant. I know one of my nominees, Ms. Claire, is sitting there, and I know this is a huge task that we've asked you all to do, and I certainly appreciate the work that you all have put into this. A couple of questions I have as far as when on the specific, talking to the spreadsheet that you had there, when we have those costs, I'm reading that as that's the cost involved in building an additional, say, if it's a strings room, that's the cost in building the strings room and doing whatever needs to be done internally as far as furnishing it and any special structures or any special configurations that has to be.
My understanding is that would be whatever costs would normally go into the CIP.
Okay.
That would be included in there. And again, if there are items like that that are already planned, that are already in the CIP, they're not included in those total dollars. Mr. Klein?
If I could add one more component, keeping in mind that when we put the matrix together, that also defines a cost, sort of, if you need some mechanism for determining the cost. So that effectively looks at a cost sort of as a standalone unit.
Right.
So while we're looking and saying, okay, this is the cost to add a strings room at a school, that's really the cost if you were doing nothing else. In all reality, if we're in there doing a renewal or doing some other work, the component cost of doing that strings room would actually come down. The problem is if you're doing the calculations, there's no real good way to balance those costs across what might or might not be happening at a school. So again, the true cost will be dependent upon what the timing is like for inflation, but also what's happening at that school, what other elements of the CIP you're implementing or constructing at the same time you're doing, in this case, say, a strings room.
Sure. No, I appreciate that.
So
The other question I have is,
that's why we're saying we can't tell you precisely what it's going to cost, but it should be less than what we put up there.
Sure.
That's worst case.
no, I appreciate that. The other thing is, and I realize that the task force probably doesn't, I don't know if you all talked about it, but it wasn't part of your mandate, but I would expect our staff to be looking at, have we considered, like, in some of the areas from and I don't want to overtask these rooms, but like I'll use an example. A storeroom is typically what I'm saying, they're very short and wide rooms, and I would imagine a strings room would be a somewhat similar, but maybe slightly different configuration. If we look, or as our staff, are we going to be looking for opportunities where maybe we can leverage and do dual use types of opportunities where we could set up a room that could be used as both as a storeroom and maybe soundproofing for strings rooms and address some of these things.
Well, without
Maybe
getting
a
into
little
the
bit,
details, we did discuss quite a bit the need to make these spaces as flexible as possible so that they could have more than one use. The idea being we want to give them additional instructional space, let them decide what's the best way to use it.
Sure. Okay. All right. Thank you. And the other question I have is just with regards to the middle school and the high school tasks that you've got before you next. That I think is going to be much more complex task. Are you planning on doing like middle schools first and then going to the high schools, or doing them all at once, or have you still working that out as a group, or?
I think the original intent was we would handle them as a group, but as we get into it, we may change our minds and decide to split it out and do middle school separately. But my guess is, based on the way the elementary school discussion went, that we'll probably do them together. There's enough similarities between the two levels. You know, they both have sports programs to a certain extent. They have, it's a different class structure. We'll see how it goes. We're going to start talking in January and go from there.
Okay. Once again, thank you again for all the work that y'all are doing. It's really needed. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Trenum. Ms. Jessie.
I guess my question, I know that each one of us had 2 representatives from our different areas, and are you talking to the people in the trenches? I mean, I'm becoming more and more aware as I talk tonight about student representation and talking to students, the people on the ground. When you made a list of things that, as a committee, you think, did you get input from, because at many of these schools there are groups like the one at Woodbridge High School. when you establish priorities, are you talking to some of those groups? Because if we don't talk to some of those groups in the formative stages, they come to the boardroom and call us out. So I'm just wondering, as the representatives for Occoquan, for example, are they talking to people in Occoquan? I don't mean just Occoquan in general, I'm just using that as an example.
I can't answer that question directly, but I do know that based on the participation of the various members, it's quite obvious that they're all very aware of what the conditions are in the schools in their districts, because they had a lot of personal stories to tell and things that other people had said to them. These are people who are, they're quite active in their school communities, so I have to assume that they have gone out and talked to members of their public.
I guess what my concern is that, are the people on that committee talking, representing their schools and their point of views, or is there a mechanism for them to get input from people in their area? I'm not sure that somehow a mechanism should be put in place to somehow get some input from other than the two people from the area, because the cases that I've had in my areas, I think I'm not sure that one of the persons on there was from that area, but I'm just saying that there should be a mechanism to get input from people who are on the ground, because I'm not sure they would establish the same priority.
Well, one thing we could do, and it will be easier because we're dealing with fewer schools total at this level, one thing that we could do would be to have all of our members try to schedule mini town halls at each of their high schools, for example, and not just talk about that high school, but invite the community in that area to come and talk about that high school and the other middle schools in the immediate vicinity. The difficulty is one of scheduling. It would be practically impossible to get the entire task force to each of these places in a timely fashion. So it would have to be, the burden would have to be on the members from each magisterial district to go and do that. But it's a good idea. Obviously, it's better to hear the input firsthand directly from people. We saw tonight how passionately people feel about Woodbridge High School. My children graduated from Stonewall Jackson, which is not one of the newer schools. So I'm sensitive to all of that. But really the question will be, we have to spend a fair amount of time as a task force talking about these issues. And so I think it's going to be, can we find a way for the individual members to go out and meet with the public that allows them to bring back for their own district? Certainly a good idea.
Thank you. In many instances, if you have a meeting, sometimes a town hall, and for the students on the board, you may have the town meeting and no one shows up to your town meeting, but your job is to have the town meeting. Right. And to advertise it and get input. The other question, I guess, earlier you said that it is or is not aligned with the present CIP, but are we trying to do, when we look at the issue of equity, you really do have to do a little bit more for the schools that have been since 1975 or whatever, and now the infrastructure, when you walk into the building and you look at this building, you think, whoa, how long has it been since this building? And then you leave that building, you go to another building, and there's a disparity. And I think that has happened, but I think that we can fix it, but I don't think we're going to be able to fix it by equal. In fact, I was talking to Mr. Klein. I thought he was really going to laugh at me, but he didn't. I said to him, we're talking STEM. Yeah. Everybody should have STEM. Everybody should have labs. So if we're going to wait 5 years for one school to get a lab, why don't you, can we buy mobile labs? Can we buy buses or something and equip them and let them go from school to school so nobody waits, because none of these kids should have to wait. There should be certain baseline things that students have, and there shouldn't be when it comes up in the CIP, because we know that STEM and this is the way of the future for our kids, and it's just moving so rapidly that it's the only thing that I can think of that's like, you know, they said, would you like another computer? And the computer is totally different. Like a year later, it's different. It's moving very rapidly, and other countries really are moving ahead of us in science and technology. So I think the weight, there needs to be a weight factor for you to consider.
You raise a very good point in the fact that things do change, not just the technology, but instruction is changing. And what we think we need right now, 5 years from now, may be totally different. So again, we're stressing be flexible and put the resources into improving the instructional opportunities, but don't get too specific now, because 5 years from now you may want to do something different. But it's a very good point. Something else I should mention in terms of us getting direct input, we went and did a site visit this year for the elementary schools. We went to Kilby, old and new. It happened to be convenient that the old one was about to close, the new one right next door was about to open. We were able to compare new standard to old school very conveniently. I would imagine we would do at least one site visit at the high school and middle school levels as well, as a task force, to again get eyes on the problem firsthand rather than hearing about it secondhand. I know for me, visiting Kilby was very useful. It's way down at the east end of the county. I'm from Gainesville, so I'm not as familiar with that area, and it was very helpful to me to see it firsthand. So I imagine we will do at least one of those, maybe one high school, one of the middle schools, and then, you know, compare. But if we can kind of coordinate that with also having a town hall meeting where people know we're going to be there and can come speak to us, so much the better. That would be good.
Thank you, Ms. Jessie. And then we've got Ms. Ralston and then Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My concern, I've been driving around similar to what you've been doing, and I've noticed that handicap parking and the accessibility between the parking and the actual door is quite a distance. We need to take a look at that, and we need to also contact the necessary people if we don't know exactly how many parking spaces you need at the schools. Be they old or new, they're not all in compliance.
We did talk about parking. Actually, it didn't rise to the level of our recommendations tonight, primarily because there is a standard for how many spaces you're supposed to have per school based on the population. And with only a couple of exceptions, most of the schools have the parking they're supposed to have. Now, again, that's parking for staff.
For staff?
Yeah, there is no standards that says you have to have X number of parking lot spaces so that you can have a back-to-school night. The facility, am I correct? The facility standard is how many you have to provide for your staff. And is that?
I mean, you know, we digress a little bit. In a sense, we are ADA compliant for all of our schools. That does not mean that it is necessarily, Garfield was a good example. The design and layout of that school, which was built in the mid-1970s, which was really built, in one sense, built to a different standard of ADA, that building was compliant. However, that did not mean it was very easy necessarily. They were defined. There's a defined number of parking spaces for the building. It's all in code. We meet or exceed those requirements. That doesn't always mean that we don't go in and add some more, because in some circumstances, that's necessary to meet the needs of students, staff, parents, et cetera. In other cases, depending on the specific circumstances, and I know you're aware of one, we added another sort of ADA, handicap parking space closer to the building, simply because while the parking spaces were valid, the ramp to the building was valid, everything was in place, it was about 75-yard uphill ramp to get to the building. It's all compliant, but it wasn't easy. So there are circumstances as we identify them that we try to go out and look at them and see how we can adjust them. And I don't know that that's as much of the infrastructure task force, but we will continue to look at that.
Is that, since you're here, is that a costly endeavor?
It can be.
Okay.
We have a bullet item here on slide 12, We didn't talk about it much, but the bottom item, there was additional on-site parking, 2.2 million. That is, it's not a small amount of money.
No.
It's certainly less than putting activity rooms in all the schools that don't have them. So there may be some specific schools that are particularly troublesome. And again, when I talk about these costs tonight, we're talking elementary school level. I don't know what it would cost because we haven't talked about it yet, but we will. I'm sure that's something that will be talked about when we get to the middle schools.
Even if you take a look at Minnieville Elementary School, the building sits sunken, and the parking is up here. And if you have a wheelchair, you can't use the stairs to walk down to the door. So you come around it's not the street, but it's the driving area. And so when you come around to, say, take another door, it's not handicap accessible. So just for that, if you don't mind taking a look or sending someone out to look at that, please. And that's all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Ralston. It'll be Mr. Deutsch, then Ms. Arnold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question about the spreadsheet. Since we're talking about parking, there's this parking deficit calculation. Can you explain what there's pluses and minuses on this parking deficit calculation? Can you explain what that?
I'm going to defer that to Mr. Klein, I think. Basically, there is a standard number of, again, there is a standard you use to determine how many slots you're supposed to have. And that calculation is showing you, according to that standard, which schools are deficient. And there was only a few of them, as I recall. Correct. That doesn't mean there is all the parking each school could want. Also, one of the issues you run into with some of the schools that are deficient is there's simply no place to put any more parking. They're very tiny sites. That's, when we say as we talk about compliance, the fact that we are technically compliant doesn't mean it's ideal. But
the numbers are a plus and minus from a predetermined ratio?
The numbers are, well, we'll let the expert talk.
Good evening. What we did with this matrix was we took the brand new elementary school, the average that we were able to get, and that is very site specific depending on the topography of the site. And then what we did was we made a ratio of that between the number of students, and then we addressed that back and forth with how many students were on our population of that particular site, if that makes sense. It was a ratio back and forth, trying to equal it so that they all had the same amount.
Makes sense. And then, so on the parking matrix and the gym and cafeteria square footage, there are some cells that are blank. Why are they blank as opposed to having zeros?
Do you want to identify one specifically? That might be easier in the sense.
Well, don't forget, every school is represented there.
Right.
But some of those schools either have already been addressed for that particular item, or they're already in the CIP for that particular item. What we're trying to call out here is the costs that are not already addressed in the CIP.
So is your gym square footage number, the number of additional gym square footage that should be added?
If I can use Kohl's as an example.
Sounds good.
Kohl's doesn't have a gym. It has an activity room and it has a cafeteria. So we've labeled the cafeteria square footage, not trying to portray it as a gym. In other words, the schools that are blank are schools that do not have a gym. If you were to go
and then what is a school like Covington Harper or Noakesville school that's listed as not having cafe or a gym have?
It could have just been that we left that off the sheet. It certainly has a gym and a cafeteria. Okay. And what we've done with that is we split the multi-purpose room into a gym and a cafeteria to get a total square footage.
Sure.
And you might have caught one we missed.
Okay. Yeah, there's a few where both of them are blank. So.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, okay, just trying to understand that.
A lot of data to look at. We realized that it was a bit of an eye chart for us as well.
Yeah, no, all good, all good. Is there any sort of prioritization of parking in relation to the availability of off-site parking? So some elementary school that's easy to park in the neighborhood, some it isn't, and so for back-to-school nights, you know, it can be a challenge in some of those schools where to.
Well, I can only speak to, at the eastern end of the county, I can only speak to Kilby because that's the one we went to visit. And parking down there would probably be very challenging off-site because it's a densely populated neighborhood, and a lot of people are parking their own cars on the street. Some of the older neighborhoods in the Gainesville district, up not too far north from where you represent, in the Stonewall area, again, those are fairly densely populated neighborhoods, and so if you haven't got parking on site, you probably don't have a whole lot of parking off site either. Parking is a challenge everywhere. I know at, what is it, Westgate. Westgate has the swim club across the street. Well, that does provide some extra parking, but most of the schools are not in a position to take advantage of things like that because they typically are in residential neighborhoods where there isn't a neighboring business that has a large parking lot that's available after hours. And I'm not sure what we do about that. It's hard enough getting the land we need to build the new schools, let alone additional land for parking.
I know one of the elementary schools in that Manassas neck of the woods is getting some additional parking. They're very appreciative. What about, so is there any look at piping systems and electronic wiring systems and them aging out? And what that replacement schedule is?
The piping, such as water piping,
Yeah.
that's really not a CIP issue. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that while we did talk about that kind of thing, that's not something that is dealt with under the CIP. That is ongoing maintenance that staff does on an ongoing basis, and when issues are addressed, they deal with them. That's not something that we were looking at because we were focused on what goes into the CIP. In terms of the electrical wiring, Dee, maybe you can.
When we plan for the CIP as far as renewals and renovations, we certainly look at all of those things. And as we start planning some of the renovations that are upcoming that you'll see in this year's CIP, we certainly have taken that even into more account. We've got now a very good matrix with our software of School Dude, where we can tell how many work orders we have when equipment is wearing out. We've got a whole lot better handle on that than we did in previous years. So yes, we are looking at that, but not part of the infrastructure or the differentials between the schools.
It really comes more under the ongoing maintenance, which is a different category. It's the kind of thing where if you're having a serious wiring issue, you're going to go ahead and you're going to deal with it. You're not going to wait for the CIP, is my impression.
All right, thank you. Ms. Arnold.
So first of all, I wanted to say that the idea of flexibility for where funds are allocated within schools makes total sense. Every school has different needs. And at the risk of this question stretching outside the bounds of this task force, I'm not exactly sure what those bounds are. I was just curious if there was a recommendation for how to allow for this degree of flexibility while still preventing the risk of misallocation of funds. For example, do you all recommend that funds are allocated to schools saying that it can go to the list of suggested areas on the spreadsheet, or is there another way that you guys were envisioning this happening?
We put some boundaries on it, but we didn't want to make it too specific. We didn't want to say, okay, school X gets a science room and school Y gets an activity room. What we did say is we want each school that's in a deficit state, the older schools that are in a deficit, each school should get at least one additional instructional asset of whatever type, so that all of the elementary schools that are not currently scheduled to have these things done would get added to the mix. And over the next 10 years, every one of the older schools would get at least one additional instructional asset. So it would involve, putting money into each school, but leaving staff some flexibility as to, at each school, what is the best use. I mean, the principal, the staff, with site-based management, they'll have some opinions about what they really need for that school. And the main thing is that they get something. Each school gets something, and every school feels like they've been given some help. but we want to keep it flexible enough so that we don't tie people into something that they really would rather not have. And every community is going to feel differently about it. Every school, the parents at every school have strong feelings about what they would like to see that school offer. So we're saying give each school some help, but leave some flexibility. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, when we're talking about flexibility, I just want to confirm and make sure that I'm not misunderstanding at all. We're not talking about giving principals a blank sum for suggested areas. We're talking about the board specifically saying within schools that this is where it should be used, or how
We're
are
saying
you
that what it
envisioning it?
should be is instructional space, because we're focused on improving instructional space, and that staff work with the board as the CIP is put together to make sure that this is allocated fairly among all the schools that need the help. The staff of the schools will certainly have, a lot of input on what's the best way to accomplish what they need to do. There may be some options where you could do it either way, and you may leave it up to the building principal to, pick one or the other, but there will be some bounds on it in terms of, what can be done most efficiently. We want to make the money go as far as it can go. We want to package these things in such a way that we get the most bang for the buck on each school.
Awesome, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Ms. Satterwhite.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Richardson, it's great to see you up here, and thank you so much for your work and the work of the committee. We greatly appreciate it. I'm really glad you addressed parking. As you mentioned, Gainesville District Schools, I've got one newer one, I have two older ones that a couple of those principals have said to me, please get me some parking. What can you do to help me get parking? One of them, the newer school, we used to have on-street parking. The subdivision changed things, and now we have no on-street parking, and we're limited. Another school, and some parents have been ticketed there in park and ride, but we fixed that for now. Another school, back to school night. I overheard several times that the fire marshal had shown up because we had people parking incorrectly. So it's an ongoing issue, and Mr. Klein, I'll address that with you later on too. So thank you for that. And I appreciate the detail that went into this. I love the chart. It's so hard to read. I've got to get out my longer paper and dig it out of my cabinet so I can print it. And I was trying to enlarge it to read
Only
it.
an accountant could love it.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm not an accountant, but yeah.
I have to take the credit or the blame, depending on how you want to look at it, for the structure of that thing. Staff made it work, and I'm sure they had to sweat to make it work, but that was I came up with the rough idea for that. I should stress again that we're not, because we have not stressed it in our prioritization, that doesn't mean we don't recognize that things like parking are not a concern. It's just that you tasked us to tell you what the priority ought to be. Obviously, if you can do anything beyond that in the CIP, it would be helpful. You and I both know very well, and it's the same all over the county, I'm sure, that parking is frequently an issue.
And that's when parking and in the morning when you're getting to the high school level, getting to school, that morning drive-in can be an issue too. So if that's something the committee has a chance to look into, I know our community in Gainesville would appreciate that.
Well, we are
And
heading
some
into
of
the
our
discussion
schools.
of the middle schools and the high schools, so we will be talking about students who drive.
Good, very good.
Quite certain.
And so looking at all of this, I like what you said about having each of the older schools add something at some point. And I know we've done a really good job at adding a lot of story rooms, activity rooms. You mentioned having the flexible space. And yesterday I was at Mountain View in our makerspace. School took a room that wasn't really being used for anything that was, I want to say there was storage in there before, but I really don't remember exactly what was in there before. They took a room and they decided, we're going to do this, and didn't ask for extra space. They had that area next to the library, and they turned it into this dynamic space for students to work. And so, maybe at some schools, instead of building a room, maybe it's adding a trailer so a classroom can build and can go in, and then we can put that space in the building. I don't know. Maybe it's some creative thinking so we can make some of these happen sooner rather than later. But I like the idea of let's talk with the principals and the community, because in one school it might be makerspace, in another school it might be the science lab. I like Mr. Trenum's suggestion, how can we use activity room or story room strings and possibly combine them. I thought that was a really insightful idea. And so thank you for all the work that's gone into this. I look forward to seeing the next report from all of you too.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Satterwhite. Anyone else? All right.
If I might
Yes, Mr. Klein.
do a brief First, I would like to take the opportunity, certainly from the staff perspective, to thank all of Mr. Richardson and all of the members of the committee for all of their time they've already put in and continue to do so as we go into the future. We have a lot of nights and a lot of time spent together trying to work through this. In sort of looking at some of the underlying discussions and concerns going on, certainly our focus and when we're doing elementaries and as we go to middles and high schools as well, is the whole discussion as it's come out of equity amongst buildings. And a brand new elementary school is always going to have its shining moment as the brand new elementary school, and a 30-year-old elementary school will never exactly match a brand new one on any given day. But we do want to work to try and look at the total scope of the facilities, the scope of what's happening, and try and do our best to look at how things can become more equitable. We have more discussion going on for high schools at the moment, it seems like, and that's really where we're looking at going into in the future as we're moving down as we go forward. From the perspective of the committee, from the perspective of staff, a vast majority of what we're looking about is certainly to keep in mind, yes, equity is an issue. So much of what we're dealing with is simply physical structures of the building. Heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems and the analysis of what condition they're in is not a function of whether it's in the north or the south or the east or the west. It's a reality of the analysis of that particular structure and where it is, what happens, where it needs. And quite often, and almost always, what's truly driving the new renewal processes is the status of the core infrastructure of the building, and that's HVAC and electrical systems and roofs and boilers. As much as we like to see what are the sometimes more cosmetic parts of the building, that's not the driving forces that are really getting us to have truly effective instructional spaces and having equity. Equity also goes the other way. There's discussion sort of, well, this is an East High School and a West High School. And I'll address that in two different ways. One is it's an equitable issue, not just it's elementary and middle and high school. All of those have competing equitable concerns, and it's not an East-West issue. I think one of the components, if we talk about high schools for a second, when we look at where our high schools are located, Brentsville is our oldest high school. Then we go to Garfield East. Then we go back to Stonewall West. Then we go to Woodbridge East. Then we go back to Osborne Park West. The next one after that was Hilton. That's actually considered east because if you look at the geographic structure of the county, it's on the eastern end. Then we came back with Forest Park, which is actually east. We did Freedom and Battlefield, one on each end, east and west. And on the newest schools we're dealing with, obviously Patriots in the west, Colgan is in the east. It is pretty well balanced if you're looking sort of at an east-west thing. The only high school that has truly been renovated is actually Potomac High School. We have done some partial renewals at Brentsville, Stonewall, Woodbridge, Garfield, and Osborne Park, and they continue to be things that we're working on. And again, those are components as we go into the infrastructure task force to saying we need to look at some of that comparability. We need to look at our components of the systems. We need to look at what's there and how it matches up. All of this fits together because what we have for the infrastructure task force ties into our maintenance programs, it ties into our CIPs. An example is, since we keep talking about Woodbridge in a sense, since 2005 we've spent almost $16 million on issues at taking care of Woodbridge High School. And that's a nice number, it's a big number. On the other hand, those are comparable kinds of numbers that we spend at Garfield and Osborne Park and Stonewall. Those are all significant amounts of money and reflect the priorities the board has put into taking care of and maintaining all of our schools. No, we can't match a 40-year-old high school to a brand new high school, but we can do our best to try and those things that are within our controls, HVAC systems, air systems, heating, lighting systems, et cetera, to see if we can't maximize those. And I think from, again, our CIP process this year, we will look at, again, the elements that are coming out of the elementary analysis, and as we participate and go forward, we add and take into account the middle school and high school components that we have going into the future. So, thank you.
Oh. Everybody's hitting buttons. It's Mr. Wilk. Mr. Wilk
Sorry,
first.
Mr. Klein.
Everybody jumped into that one.
I want you to. I have an asterisk next to Potomac High School because there's something I want. I don't want people to walk away and think there was some specialty thing done for a building. The building was incomplete when it was first constructed. So
That's
can
correct.
you explain that to the public, please?
Potomac High School, when it was built, which would have been our 6th high school at the time, was built on a limited budget, and in fact was not built for the size and scope of the original design. It was, we have this much money, we're stopping with this amount of construction. We went in there with an idea that we would do a renovation, but we were also doing an addition at the same time to try and expand and complete the facilities there, partly because we anticipated things like Potomac Shores starting to come in and the fact that we would have additional capacity in there. That doesn't mean it's perfect. A good example is the auditorium at Potomac High School. It sits in the very core of the building. It's about 600 seats maybe. There's nothing you can do with it. It can't be adjusted. You'd have to tear the whole school down around it. Therefore, when we go to auditoriums, Potomac is not equitable in the size of the scope of total auditorium space, but you really can't do anything about it. And then, of course, because it was sort of our first high school renovation, we did things to try and improve the parking lots. We added instructional spaces. We improved the specialty school program. We went into the football stadium and had areas there that were falling down. We did go ahead and build a field house. Part of it is we were there. We're not going back for 30 years, 25, 30. We needed to do it. It's a vast improvement over what it was. It had some significant shortcomings going in. I could tell you a story about every single one of our high schools, probably every single one of our middle schools. But again, part of this is then to tie in where are we at, what are the elements on each of them that are different, and to help look as we move forward with a matrix at how we can identify and prioritize the most significant issues in each of those buildings, and in a sense, working with the community, the board, staff, et cetera, to pull it all together so we can optimize our money, our resources, to best outfit and maintain our schools.
Thank you, Mr. Wilk. Ms. Jessie.
Now, Mr. Klein, why did you guys have to bring up Woodbridge? I mean, since the building was built in 1975, that would make it about 40, almost 40 years. We talked about so many $1 million over that period of time. I've been over there, and so I would prefer that, especially when people have been in the boardroom talking about their school, that if we have something that to say we've already done so much at Woodbridge High School, and they've been in this room several times, could we just keep it in the private conversations, because we are meeting with them, and I would prefer that be, because they will listen to this and decide there's no point in us coming to this boardroom because you've already decided that we've spent so many $1 million on you. I'm not sure where the millions were spent, but I've been over there, and there's some issues there. The same thing Mr. Brand said. He looked at Stonewall, and when on our committee, I think we were at the Nokesville, which is, by the way, a beautiful facility. I hadn't been in there. It's gorgeous, glass everywhere. I don't want to get into this race thing about race and the inequities in terms of race, but I think that there are parent groups that are more comfortable in this boardroom and more comfortable in advocating. And so when they come to the boardroom, I just don't want that to be misperceived, and I know that you didn't mean for it to be misperceived because you and I are buddies.
I would not like it misperceived, because I certainly believe that each and every time that there is someone here that talks about any facility for any school that comes and talks, we listen and we take notes and we go back and look and see what's there. My opinion in that sense is, yes, as they're describing things at Woodbridge High School, I see I mean, from my perspective, I see a very similar set of circumstances to Garfield, to Stonewall, to Osborne Park, all of which have needs and all of which we need to work on. That
They
eventually
didn't come in the
becomes
boardroom. They did not come into the boardroom. And so I would like for this discussion about Woodbridge High School and what you guys see at other high schools, because the other high schools didn't come into this boardroom. So if we could keep that on a private basis, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Dr. Waltz, yes, sir.
I would just like the figure that you stated for Woodbridge. That was what was
That
the
was
figure?
from
again?
2005.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Waltz.
I'm going to go out, just speaking just for myself. Obviously, the task force hasn't had a chance to dig into this yet, but I would imagine that what we do with the middle schools and the high schools is going to be a lot more tailored to the individual schools. The elementary schools, we came up with a much more uniform recommendation, but every high school and every middle school is going to have its own unique set of circumstances, and I think we're just going to need to be more sensitive and make sure we get input from each school in terms of what concerns them the most. Obviously, it would be better if we're going to spend some money at a school, that we at least spend it on the thing they want us to spend it on. If we can't spend it on everything, let's at least fix the most important issues. But that's a discussion we'll have to get into in the coming year.
I thought we're done. Not so lucky. Mr. Deutsch, you're up.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to both of you, because I think the conversation that this task force is meant to address is the issue of equity across all of our schools. And so understanding what the inefficiencies are, what the balances are, that's important. And so I just want to say I appreciate Mr. Klein's comments about the differences between our high schools, because age is an important factor. And I've got a number of concerns with OP and Stonewall that are both very close to where I am. And there are things that need to be improved, and I think we all recognize it, and we work in different ways to improve all of our older schools. And so where we can keep working equitably across the county to address our issues is critical. And there's nothing wrong with bringing that up when that's the issue at stake here. And I think the point was just made about not wanting to inflame based on race and sides of the county and whatnot. But apparently whichever school board member has been emailing back with parents has been actively inflaming along those lines. And we need to knock that off so we can actually help our kids and understand the facts on the ground related to age and how we keep our older schools up to date.
Anyone else? Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.